Well, Spencer, good afternoon. I'd like to begin by congratulating you on winning the Kistler Prize for the year 2007. As you know, you're joining distinguished company at a very ripe young age of 38. Tell me how you feel about that.
My God, Sesh, it is a huge honor. To begin with, I'd like to thank the foundation, you and Bob and Walter in particular, for your faith in me as a scientist, as a young scientist. It is daunting to look at the past winners of this prize, including a man who served as my postdoctoral advisor at Stanford, Luca Cavalli-Sforza, for many years. And to be placed in the same category as those minds, as those scientists, is a little bit daunting. But I very much appreciate your faith in me and what we're doing in the Genographic Project, the work that I've done so far, and the work that I'll continue to do in the future. I have a sense that part of the reason you're giving this to me at the ripe young age of 38, as you say, is that you want to encourage me in my career as I move forward.
Absolutely.
So instead of it being a reward for a lifetime of what I've already done, it's more about you think that I've achieved something and then the potential of what might still come.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's get some basic things out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
As I'm sure you are aware, there's considerable controversy being generated by what I will describe as indigenous populations about the nature of the project, and if I recall, basically going through what they have objected to is having to do with the idea of not providing or getting informed consent. The second thing that I could extract from all of the publications that I could read was about some absence of a lack of quid pro quo or a benefit accruing out of this study.
Mm-hmm.
And thirdly, perhaps shattering a sense of who they are in terms of identity, background, myths, and so on. Why don't we get that out of the way and address these objections and how you have met them? Or are they substantive? Do they make any sense?
Okay, you're starting with the easy question first. Good. The question of indigenous participation in this project is vital. I mean, the reason we are focusing so much of our scientific work on indigenous populations is because these are people who retain a connection to their past, to the geography where they live, to a much greater extent than those of us who have moved here from somewhere else. I live in the east coast of North America. My ancestors come from all over Northern Europe. What do my genetic patterns tell you about the prehistory of America or even one particular part of Europe? Virtually nothing. So we ideally want people who have been living in the same place for a long period of time and retain that link back to the past. That's the reason why indigenous participants are so important to the project. Now, in terms of the objections, we have received a few, as you say. The consent issue hasn't really been a major objection. The people have raised concerns about it, but we've thought long and hard about how you go about doing these sorts of studies. Consent is slightly different for indigenous groups than it is for people in an empowered Western society, a liberal democracy. We tend to think of consent issues as being an individual choice. Whereas indigenous groups often have collective ownership of many resources, and that would include their genetic patrimony. And so you have to go about the consent process by approaching the group initially, and we always do that. We have an entree to the group. Someone who is interested in the project may have heard about it. They may know a researcher already, something like that. We have an entree to the group. We explain to the group, often to a group of elders, what it is we're trying to do. And often we have a group meeting and explain to everybody in the village or whatever it might be what the project is all about, what the benefits are, and what the potential risks are. And after that, we then, for the individuals who want to participate, if the group as a whole decides to participate, the individuals also give consent. So we go through this two-tiered process. I don't think there is any other way to do this. I don't think there is a better way, if you will. I think that we've studied this very carefully. We've learned from past mistakes that other people have made, and we've taken that into account in the design of the ethical protocol that we follow. The other issue, I guess, you had was the benefits, the quid pro quo. The benefits for indigenous people, just like everybody else, would be finding out something about your history.
About themselves,
Yeah, something about where they came from, the genetic side of the story. Now, we're very clear to say that the genetic story, certainly for the small piece of the genome that we're studying, is not everything. and it certainly doesn't define you.
Right.
You know, so your mitochondrial DNA haplogroup is not going to tell you who you are, but it tells you a little bit about your past and who your ancestors might have been, at least on that lineage. So it's not like we're trying to replace traditional stories. We're trying to add to them. And if people find that interesting and beneficial, and many of them do, 30,000 participants from the indigenous communities around the world have chosen to be a part of the project already. If they find that interesting, then, you know, they, like everybody else who joins the project, will get something out of it. Are they going to get improved medical care? Are they going to get a, you know, a direct monetary benefit? No, no. But, you know, they get the same sort of benefit that all the other participants do. And as I said, many people are participating. I think it's a little bit condescending to say that, you know, as some of our detractors have, that indigenous people are not as interested in learning about this stuff as the rest of the people in the world. You know, I think a lot of them are, and, you know, the numbers show that. Now, in terms of the final point that you make, and this is the real crux of the issue, in my opinion, will something about the worldview be threatened? Potentially, yes. You know, potentially that might happen. That's the point of science. We're discovering new things, and people may have a perception of the way the world is. The world is flat. And yet, you look at the science and the world turns out to be round. Right. And the sun is not revolving around us. So, you know, that's the way science works, is it's constantly pushing the boundaries. And again, we explain very carefully to all the participants that they may find out something that contradicts some long-held notion.
Myths and their legends and
a traditional story. And ultimately, it does come down to a debate about the scientific worldview. I mean, do you think that science is the way we should be investigating these things, or do you think we should rely on stories that we've gotten from our elders? You know, people have portrayed it as the mythos versus logos debate, where logos is logic and science and striving to, you know, learn something about the future based on the tools of logic. And mythos is where you basically accept the world that your parents and grandparents bequeathed to you and the stories that they told you, and you never question that. You know, that is a bigger debate than you know, we can solve in this project. I am a scientist. I use scientific methods to investigate the past, and, you know, the people who participate in the project think that is a valid way of doing it. But some people may choose not to participate, and that's fine.
It's understandable, though, because even living in the most advanced society, if one can describe the U.S. to be that way, this whole decentering that has taken place from the Copernican revolution to the Darwinian concepts of evolution and so on, has still not been reconciled even in this society where the majority of people don't believe in evolution.
I know,
so
and
it's understandable that they would feel that way.
I find it appalling that in a way we seem to have regressed over the last 20 or 30 years. I cannot believe that in the year 2007 we are still having debates about whether, you know, intelligent design should be taught in high school biology classes. Because when I was growing up in the 1970s and early 80s, you know, there might have been a few people who talked about that, but it, you know, it was accepted that evolution was a scientific fact, and that's what you learned about in science classes. If you wanted to learn about creationism, you took a religion class. Why are we suddenly having this debate? It's a bigger issue in society. I mean, it's something that I'm actually talking about in my next book. There's a kind of resurgent fundamentalism everywhere in the world. I mean, we in America think about Islamic fundamentalism, but, you know, we're going through that same kind of resurgence. And why is it? I think it's because a lot of people feel left out of the future that's being created. They're afraid of the pace of change. They feel that they don't play a role in this logos-driven future, this science, rational future. And they're reacting to that and saying we need to return to the old ways. We need to go back to the ways that have comforted us, even though they didn't actually comfort people, and, you know, many people were harmed by those old ways. But I think it's part of a broader pattern in society. I just saw the other night the film Inherit the Wind. I don't know if you've seen that, Spencer Tracy. And it's basically, 1960. It's about the Scopes monkey trial, but when it came out in 1960, it was also a commentary on McCarthyism. And so these are larger issues that have played out in society over the last century or so, and I think, unfortunately, it's still something that we as scientists have to deal with. And, you know, again, we're not trying to replace anybody's sense of self. We're not trying to take, you know, the comfort of the past away from people. What we're trying to say is science also plays a role in understanding who you are.
Perhaps it also has to do with the fact that religion or faith systems or belief systems essentially are collectivist in their natures. And so therefore, if an institution such as a religion or a faith system is collectivist, power and influence is vested in a few people at the top, whereas knowledge in a modern context is accessible to anyone based on the scientific method. And so it poses an inherent threat to their own status and their standing vis-a-vis their influence over their herds.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to that extent, they are likely to lead the resistance rather than saying, well, let me get out of the way and let you understand what the science is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think, knowledge is democratizing.
Exactly.
By its
and
very
it breaks
nature.
down hierarchic structures.
Exactly, and particularly with the access to knowledge being so democratic now.
Yes.
You don't have to be located at a university or in a major city with a large library. You can go on the internet and get basically most of the world's information, and more of that is going to become available. Anybody, anywhere in the world with an internet connection, and hopefully within the next decade or two, everybody will have one, can get to whatever they need to know, and they can make up their own minds. What's interesting is that a lot of these fundamentalist groups are actually making use of that power of the internet to spread their story. Yes, so
Exactly.
they're in opposition to what the internet stands for, and yet they're using it. To
But
their
that's good, though. I mean, in the that process itself should also be evolutionary, in the sense that just like we biologically have evolved, surviving by virtue of our fitness, ideas should go through the same process.
That's right. I agree.
Let it all
The
hang out
meme, the
and
concept of the meme.
exactly.
Yeah.
Let there be mimetic evolution. See what ends up at the end. My conclusion is that they will lose. Knowledge and science will win.
I think so. I certainly hope you're right as a scientist. At this point in time, we're at a critical juncture. Yeah.
Along the same lines, as I'm sure we have been observing, me longer than you have given your age, that globalization.
Are we going to keep harping on this?
Globalization is progressing, I would think, at an exponential pace right now. So what risks do you see in terms of cultures, in terms of languages, in terms of ourselves as societies because of the homogenization that is taking place? For instance, in a biological sense, is globalization exacerbating the risk, for instance, of a genomic homogenization which would make us susceptible to a pandemic of sorts?
Well, I don't really see genetic homogenization, which is obviously going on. People are moving around to a much greater extent than they ever have. I don't see that as exacerbating or increasing the likelihood of a global pandemic, because we'll still have genetic variation. The key for me and what I do as an anthropological geneticist is that we will have lost the context of those patterns of genetic variation. So, what I study is human diversity. And I study basically the underlying patterns of human diversity, how we laid down the diversity we see around the world today. And that is a very long story, by human lifetime standards. It's a story that began in Africa 200,000 years ago with the appearance of our species. And we stuck around in Africa for a very long time, about 150,000 years. And then between 50 and 60,000 years ago, a small group of Africans, after going through a near extinction event, so basically there was a huge homogenization process before we ever started to leave Africa. A small group left Africa and went out and populated the world. And today we are scattered all over the continent, 6.5 billion people speaking 6,000 different languages, all different appearances and so on. How did we create those patterns of diversity? Now, as you said, we're now mixing and moving around to a much greater extent, becoming more like Tiger Woods, as I've said in my book, The Journey of Man. That is changing, but basically what we're trying to do is peer beneath the surface of that. So we know that that's something that's happened in the last couple of centuries. How did we create those initial patterns of diversity around the world? And our ability to do that is threatened by the mobility revolution of the last 2 centuries, since the Industrial Revolution. And as people move and mix, they're going to carry their genes with them, which is why I don't think we're at greater risk for a pandemic. Although certainly people moving around increases the spread of diseases. But again, we're going to lose the context of the genetic variation. So the trail that I follow as a forensic detective, if you will, is going to be lost.
It's a permanent record that'll move around, but in that sense, where it came about is what's lost.
Yeah, it's the context. It's the context.
Whereas culturally and otherwise, all bets are off.
Well, culturally,
McDonald's everywhere.
Yeah, culturally, I mean, it's probably a good thing, sociologically speaking, for people to be more mobile and to encounter, far off lands and places and people who speak different languages and people who look different, and to mix with them and to, create more of a melting pot, because it breaks down the differences between different societies and it encourages communication. And as we know, people who study the history of technology, the kind of long-term history of technology, the evolution, cultural evolution of ideas happens faster the more exchange there is. And we need new ideas. We've got a lot of major challenges facing us, as you guys know very well.
Same thing with technology too. The rate of change of technology is far higher than our ability to adapt and use it.
Yes, yeah.
Anyway, so for the uninitiated, like myself, would you do me a big favor and explain or define the basic terms that are common currency in the kind of work you're doing? Gene, allele, haplotype, mutation.
Okay. Let's step back and let's talk about the genome. So I think the genome is something that's in common parlance now. People read articles about it all the time. Craig Venter a couple of weeks ago just published his own genome, the first
In fact, I was
diploid
going to
genome.
get to that. Okay.
So the genome is the sum total of all the genetic material that you're carrying in your body, and it is composed of DNA, which is composed of 4 subunits. We call them A, C, G, and T: adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. And it's the sequence of these in a linear order in the DNA molecule, the famous double helix, that is basically the blueprint to make another version of you. And most of the genome has no known function. It almost certainly does have a function. There have been several studies that have come out over the past year suggesting that what we previously called junk DNA, meaning we didn't know about it, is not really junk. And it's probably, in some ways, even more important than a lot of the genes that are sitting in there. But basically, you've got genes, which traditionally have only coded for proteins, but now there are probably other gene-like regions that are important in regulating the genome. You've got the stuff in between the genes. You've got regulatory sequences. You've got structural sequences around the ends of the chromosomes and around the centromeres in the center of the chromosomes. So that is your genome. A gene is a block of DNA, which up until quite recently coded for a protein. And the proteins were thought to be the important part of the cell. They work out in the cytoplasm. They're the machinery. So this is the blueprint. It tells you how to make a new machine, a new forklift or whatever it is out there doing the heavy labor. Exactly, in the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, people are not identical. You walk down the street and you notice that people are different, and most of those differences are caused by differences in DNA sequences. So if you compare the DNA, a chromosome, one of these bundles, linear bundles of DNA from one person to another person, you'll see that there are differences between them. They're not identical. And we differ on average at about 1 in every 1,000 nucleotide positions. Now again, there's new evidence coming out suggesting that there's more complex variation, copy number variation, where you increase the number of copies of a gene, and there are inversions and insertions and deletions that play into this. But basically what we study, because we can actually measure the rate, are what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And these occur at a rate of roughly 1 in every 1,000 nucleotides as you scan down the genome.
So there would be what?
So we're 90
million potential change differences.
Basically, three between 2 unrelated individuals,
given that there is,
which is actually a very small level of
bases,
variation. So we're 99.9% identical. If you look at other species of large primates, apes, like orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, they have between 4 and 10 times as much variation as humans do. And the reason for this, we believe, is because of that bottleneck event, the near extinction event, between 60 and 70,000 years ago while we were still living in Africa. We dropped down to probably only a couple of thousand people. And so that's reflected in our... Exactly. So that was a founder population. We had probably a somewhat larger population, which had been stable, throughout the early part of that period, the late Pleistocene. And then we suddenly go down to this very small population, and then we expand back from that to create the diversity we see today. The big question is, okay, so we've got this low level of diversity. Why do we have so much variation on the surface? And we still don't have the answer for that. But anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. So these variant forms of the gene are known as alleles. Okay, so you can have allele A or allele B.
Different variations
exactly,
of the same
different
gene.
forms of the same gene.
Good. Okay.
And so what was the other term that you wanted to hear about?
Haplotype?
Haplotype is basically the set of variants, the linked set of variants that you possess. So it is effectively a scan of your genome, a continuous scan of that strand of your DNA.
Okay, so a gene,
it's
an
describing
allele, and
the
haplotype.
state of your particular genome at these positions that are known to vary.
I see. And they are consistent. They're consistent with everybody that would have my ancestry. These haplotypes.
Okay, so your haplotype, if we look at enough positions in your genome, is unique to you. It is a fingerprint. That is your haplotype. But there are certain markers that link your haplotype to other haplotypes that relate it. So you share certain markers with other people, and these markers occur from time to time as the DNA is being passed down through the generations. They occur randomly and at a relatively low rate, around 50 per genome per generation. So they're relatively rare. 50 out of 6 billion is not that big. So if you share one of these markers with someone, that means you share an ancestor at some point in the
Right.
past. And so that defines you as a member of a haplogroup or an
Okay,
ancestral
okay,
clan. So
okay,
that a haplogroup is a collection of related haplotypes that share a particular marker.
Okay. And then you keep going back till you
And so
isolate
this,
that marker.
right, exactly. This allows us to draw people together, the
Mhm.
branches on the tree, into ever deeper branches, and eventually
Right.
we get back to the root of the tree.
Mhm. So, just to elaborate on that, for descriptive purposes, I am R1A M17.
Mhm.
What does that mean?
That is a lineage that most likely originated on the Russian steppes or perhaps in Central Asia.
And mind-blowing in the sense that I was born and raised in South India.
Exactly, exactly. But it originated probably between 10 and 15,000 years ago, and it underwent a massive expansion within the last 5,000 years, probably concomitant with the spread of Indo-European languages driven by the spread of domesticated horses. So these were probably the first people living on the steppes of Russia, or as I said, northern Kazakhstan, somewhere in that area, around the Black Sea or the Caspian, who domesticated the horse, and this gave them mobility.
Mobility.
Mobility
Ultimately,
that
it's all
humans had
about
never,
mobility. Yes, yes.
humans had never had before. And they spread their languages, we believe, down into India. So it's the reason why the Indian languages, most of them except for the ones spoken in the south,
Indo-European.
are Indo-European, related to the European languages, even though they're very far
Sure.
from Europe. So, yeah, that's
So,
the story we think.
Something you just said leads me to the next question about horses, about languages, and a biological determination about R1AM17.
Mhm.
How do you go about associating the context for that biological information? Am I making sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's
Because how did you suddenly say, well, okay, that was 11,000 years ago, and here is how I can find that it had something to do with a language or a horse?
Absolutely. No, that's a really good question. And there's a bit of a leap of faith.
Okay.
Okay, it's an interpretation.
Oh, okay.
So we as geneticists uniquely are able to study biological ancestry. We can say how people are related to each other. And we can say, for instance, that someone from southern India
Mhm.
is related to someone from Norway.
Yeah.
Okay, which is kind of odd. Yeah, I mean, relatively closely related. I'm not
Right.
talking about going back to
Yeah,
Africa.
yeah,
I'm talking
yeah,
about within the last 5 or 10,000 years. So you have to explain that. And what you do is you look at the putative site of origin of these particular lineages. So R1A, again, I mentioned somewhere
Mhm.
around the Caspian or Black Sea. And you look at the timing of the expansion. And then you say, was there anything going on in the archaeological record, for instance, around this time? And you look and you see, yes, people started to domesticate horses. We see the spread of a particular culture, the Kurgan culture, eastward into Central Asia, northward into Scandinavia around this time, and eventually reaching India, it's thought. You then look at things like the Vedic texts.
Right.
And there's a huge debate about what happened to the Harappan civilization, which was in Pakistan. Were they destroyed by invading Indo-Europeans from the steppes, or did they simply leave because of environmental
Right.
change, or what happened? But there is some evidence, at least in the Vedic text, that there was the movement of people from north of that region down into the Indian subcontinent. So it's consistent with the archaeological pattern that we see, and the linguistic pattern. And so you start to put two and two together, and you say, well, we see the spread of this marker at the same time that you see the spread of this culture. It's consistent that, it was probably driven, at least in part, by the spread of those people. Because literally, you had to get people moving from point A to point B.
Right.
I mean, this is not the spread of just a culture. This is the spread of your particular genetic lineage. I mean, you are literally cousins with some Norwegian Viking. And so we have to have an explanation for how those people moved and why they would have
in
moved.
different
Because that's a
directions.
long way to go.
Right, it is a long ways to go. Along those lines, I've recently read a couple of books. I'm not exactly sure how to categorize them, by Graham Hancock. Are you familiar with his work?
I have heard of Graham
It
Hancock,
has
yeah.
to do, and I think one of them is called Heaven's Mirror,
Yes.
talking essentially about the fact, and here it's specific reference to some Middle Eastern civilizations and perhaps some South Indian
Mm-hmm.
cultures that existed, and actually a city-state off the west coast of India,
Mm-hmm.
basically pointing to the fact, this goes back to what you mentioned about what happened to the Harappans and so on, is that right around between 11 to 13,000 years ago constitutes the end of the Ice Age,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps quite a lot of flooding,
Mm-hmm.
which actually made a lot of the cities literally disappear into the oceans,
Yep.
and they are now discovering that some of them do exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to a diaspora out of the Middle East and in the southern parts of India out to other parts of the world. In other words, in a sense, actually maybe even the reverse of what the genetic record seems to
Mhm.
suggest.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Okay, well,
It's
I would say
interesting
that's
reading.
very, yeah, it's very speculative.
Yeah.
There's certainly no evidence for proper cities anywhere
Yeah.
in the world, even in India, submerged off the coast at 11 to 13,000 years ago. The first cities don't really appear until around 4,000, 5,000
Okay.
BC, so 7,000 years ago. And they appear first, as far as we know, in the Middle East, although there were probably some very early cities in India as well, and there was probably a separate origin of agriculture in India. Rice agriculture probably originated separately from what the one in China, in northeastern India, in the foothills of the Himalayas, which is where the wild ancestors of rice grow. And so there was probably an expansion driven from that side, possibly a separate domestication event, other species in southern India. But it's quite possible that, yes, that very early on there were separate, autochthonous Indian cities. Did they disperse because of the rising sea levels? No, I think that probably happened much earlier and wouldn't have driven that many people away. And if it had driven them away, it probably would have been a slow, kind of gradual move inland. They would have abandoned an old city,
Right.
but then rebuilt it a little bit further inland, which may happen to us over the next century or two as sea
Quite
levels come
likely,
back
it
up.
seems. Okay, so again, coming back to the technicalities of determining mutations and haplotypes and so on, this is a question that came to me that I was unable to answer, having to do with the fact that the Y chromosome paternally is transmitted, which forms the basis for determining the information on what mutation, what haplotype, and so on. The question came up as, what does a woman do to find out their genetic lineage?
Well, women can look at their mother's line. So men and women inherit something known as mitochondrial DNA from
right.
their mothers. And so this is passed down through a purely maternal line. Men can't pass it on. And it's because the mitochondria are found in the cytoplasm of the cell. And we get our cytoplasm from the egg, from our mother's egg. The sperm only donates the chromosomes that go into the nucleus. It doesn't donate, as far as we know, any mitochondrial DNA. If it does, it's a very rare event, and basically we're just looking at a purely maternal lineage. So women can look at that and find out something about their mother's 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 mother. Men can also do that. They can find out about their mother's side by looking at their mtDNA, but only men have Y chromosomes, so only men can look at that line.
Right. So in your genographic studies, are you collecting only male samples?
We are focusing on men for the indigenous sampling we're doing because we get more bang for our buck, if you will, because we can sample both the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from men. When we go out in the field, we try to get as many male samples as possible. Now, if there are women who want to participate, we're happy to take the samples, but we were particularly interested in men because, you know, for the sampling expenditure,
For the integrity of the
well,
information.
no, but for the amount that we're spending getting out in the field and doing the sampling and doing the DNA preps and all of that, it would make more sense to get both Y and mtDNA from one individual if we could. So it's better to go after men, scientifically speaking, but, you know, for social reasons and cultural reasons, sometimes we sample women as well.
So, stepping back, based on everything you have discovered so far, how many separate migrations out of Africa have occurred so far?
Well, we see clear evidence in the archaeological record of several migrations before we start to see genetic evidence. So, in all likelihood, Homo erectus, or as it's known in Africa, Homo ergaster, started to leave Africa around 1.8 million years ago. And so erectus was spread all over the continent of Asia, typically in the tropics and the subtropics, and might have existed there until very recently. If you believe that Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, which was found in the island of Flores in Indonesia recently, was around until 12,000 years ago, and it was erectus, then, you know, erectus was around until basically we drove it to extinction, because we were clearly living there at that time. So that was a very early migration. We don't see any genetic evidence of that because that's way back before we can, you know, start to see the genetic patterns. We coalesce at a much more recent date. There was a later migration of archaic Homo sapiens, Homo heidelbergensis, as it's known in Europe, probably left Africa around 500,000 years ago, and these individuals gave rise to the Neanderthals, which appeared in Europe around 250,000 years ago. Again, we came into Europe later than that, around 35,000 years ago, encountered them and drove them to extinction in all likelihood. Then there's us. And we, as I mentioned before, appear in the fossil record in Africa around 200,000 years ago. And we don't start to leave until around 60,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. And the evidence is that there were two migrations, two early migrations. One right around this 60,000 year mark, 55 to 60,000 years ago, which took a coastal route. So this would have been across the Bab al-Mandab, down through the Arabian Peninsula, the south coast of Asia, people beachcombing.
Yeah.
moving a little bit further, every week, every month, every season in search of food. Primarily gathering, so gathering mollusks, doing a little bit of trapping of fish. They probably started to experiment with new fishing methods, maybe develop rudimentary fishing hooks and nets and so on, but basically people living off of the riches of the sea. And they were the only hominids living there at the time, as far as we can tell, so, the riches were pretty rich. And they simply followed them a little bit further, and there was probably somewhat of a population expansion effect that helped to drive this, but it's not that they were setting out to conquer the world, setting out to, migrate to Australia, which is where they, reached by around 50,000 years ago. Simply moving a little bit further, every season in search of food. So that's the evidence is that that's the first migration of our ancestors, modern humans, fully modern humans out of Africa. There was probably a second one, an inland route, which came out between 45 and 50,000 years ago. And it probably came across what is today the Sahara Desert, possibly moving down the Nile Valley. But we know that the climate of the Sahara has changed substantially over the last 100,000 years or so. There are things called sapropels, which we find in cores from the sediments in the eastern Mediterranean, which reveal that every 23,000 years or so, the Sahara is actually a pretty nice place to live.
Exactly.
It's fairly wet.
I read that it was actually quite green. at one
Exactly,
time. Yeah.
but only for a short period of time. So we have one of these wetter phases between 45 and 50,000 years ago. We have another one around 30,000 years ago, and we had another one at the end of the last ice age. The wettest period was probably around 8,000 years ago. And so during these wet phases, it's actually fairly easy for populations to expand up into the Sahara. It's grassland at that time. There are lakes everywhere, lots of game. And it was during one of these wetter phases, we believe, between 45 and 50,000 years ago, that another group of Africans took off for the Middle East. Then the door was slammed shut. The Sahara became very dry. So did the Middle East, and that probably helped to force them into Central Asia. Again, they were adapted to hunting on the grasslands, and that's where the grass was. So they moved into the grasslands of Central Asia, and from there they were poised to spring into Europe, across to East Asia, and ultimately the Americas. There were also back migrations, because during the next wet phase, around 30,000 years ago, it looks like some people from the Middle East moved back into North Africa, and we see genetic evidence in some of the isolated populations of the Sahara today. And then a later migration during the Neolithic around 8,000 years ago. Again, it was a good place to grow food, people moving in out of the Fertile Crescent, and so we see evidence of an exchange during these wetter phases.
Is it still the conclusion based on your studies, if I recall watching The Journey of Man, that the Khoisan is the tribe from which all modern humans...
Well, we've actually modified that now. We've got a paper which we're about to submit to Science, trying to get at that big question of what was going on in Africa during that 150,000 year period before we left. So we appear in the fossil record, modern humans are there, and we don't start to leave for 150,000 years. What was happening? Most people kind of ignore that. They just think of Africa as being the source, but that's a long period of time for things to happen. And it turns out that in all likelihood, the San were a side branch of human evolution, if you will, that became separated. The ancestors of the San became separated from the main line of human evolution probably 150, 160,000 years ago, isolated in southern Africa. And in effect, it's the East African population that was the main line of human evolution. And starting around 70,000 years ago, this population started to expand. This was probably driven by advances in culture, the dawn of the late Stone Age or the Upper Paleolithic, which gave them some kind of an advantage in hunting or whatever it might have been. But we see evidence of a population expansion starting in East Africa, which then re-engulfed the San population, brought them back into the human gene pool, and they also expanded out of Africa. So we think about the hominid bushy tree. You've heard about this, where you have lots of different species forming and going extinct.
In fact, I was going to ask you about that. In a recent study,
the interpretation of this is that basically the San were on their way to becoming a separate incipient species of humanity,
but then got rolled back
and then
in.
they were pulled back in. So that's the reason they have such divergent genetic lineages.
Because a Leakey descendant recently published a study, Meavy, or I don't know how...
Meave Leakey, yes.
Leakey, saying that this notion of a ladder-like evolution of humans from Australopithecine to Afarensis,
because they overlap. In fact, I'm going to show a slide tonight in my talk that illustrates
quite
that
a
very
few
well.
of them existed simultaneously. In Africa. That's what the evidence seems to show, and this is...
Yeah, I mean, we've always known that there were, lots of odd things going on between 4 and 2 million years ago. The Australopithecines and, the robust Australopithecines and the gracile.
How come you don't know more about all this? It's only 2 million years ago. Jeez.
You know, so we've accepted that that was bushy, but we've always thought that once our genus, Homo, appears, Homo habilis, appears around 2.3 million years ago, from there on it's a straight shot. What Meave's paper showed is that, in fact, there's a period of around 500,000 to 800,000 years where habilis and erectus overlap with each other.
Right.
Two separate species living in the same place at the same
same
time.
time, yeah.
Which one are we descended from?
Yeah,
You know, it's
exactly.
not necessarily habilis erectus us. Now it could be habilis us, or it could be erectus us with
Or
habilis
it
having
could be
nothing to do.
habilis erectus and then something else us.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
so
the missing pieces are still missing.
I always say, I mean, it's really important to study paleoanthropology because it's fascinating and it presents us with possibilities about our past and our ancestry, but it doesn't give us the probabilities about who we're actually related to, and that's why we resort to DNA.
Now, this is something else. Another study that I recently was looking at was studying dental fossils that seemed to suggest that Asian populations had a far larger role in colonizing Europe than previously thought.
Well, yeah, and that was, again, I think,
As opposed to the
conflating all of the
Africans.
different migrations
Yeah.
that have gone on. So I mentioned, you know, the one at 1.8 million years ago
Yeah.
with Erectus, and then the one of archaic Homo sapiens, and then the modern humans. It's possible, we haven't seen any genetic evidence of this, but it is possible that some of these different migrations could have mixed. Again, we don't see any genetic evidence for this. We don't know the underlying genes that determine tooth morphology. So I would say it's very difficult to know how much weight to place in particular characters in the teeth. Some things can probably change quite easily and you can get convergent evolution. Other things probably require many genetic changes and they're much more important to study.
Right.
We don't know what the underlying genetic causes are. So it's a question of how you weight the characters that you're studying. And they weight them all equally, and you know that's not valid necessarily. But it is possible. It is an intriguing theory, and I think this is a much more likely possibility, you know, to come out of their work, that when Erectus left, something happened in Asia, and there was a back migration of those Erectus populations into Africa, and those were the ones who ultimately evolved into Homo sapiens in Africa, and then there was another out of Africa migration.
Oh, I
That is
see.
a possibility, and that's quite difficult to test.
Right.
It's a very complicated model.
Right. Okay, you did mention Craig Venter's name just a little while ago. So coming back to his, the research that they have mapped his own X and Y chromosome completely, rather
All
than
of his
the-
chromosomes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all of it,
all
exactly.
23
of
pairs.
it, all,
Yeah.
all of them. And basically the determination is that there's far greater variability between individuals than previously thought, A. And so that leads me to the next question, is if that is the case, then is the genetic variability and the distance between genetic groups also greater, and therefore lead to conclusions such as perhaps that, you know, the notion that groups are essentially the same with minor differences within the human family is not justified, and that groups are likely to be far greater variability than we thought, giving substance to the notion of race and groups and things like that.
Now,
You know,
what
it's like-
Craig found, as you said, was that there is more variation in the human genome than we suspected. Now, what he didn't find was that there's more single nucleotide variation. Again, those are the changes we actually know about the rate at which they occur. He found that basically it's 0.1%, so 1 in every 1,000 positions in the gene.
1 second, Spencer, if you could, when you use the expression rate, the rate at which they occur, for the benefit of illustrating or explaining, that is in terms of time frames.
It's in terms of time frames.
what is
It's
the
also in
frequen-
terms of the frequency of these in
Right.
the genome.
So
So
what is
1 in
that
every
time frame?
1,000 nucleotide
Tides. But
position.
time frame, you associate times to it.
Right, exactly. So
So
what
how
we can
much
do is
time?
we can compare humans and chimpanzees,
Right.
and now we have some Neanderthal sequence,
Right.
and we can, we know the divergence time of these
Right.
based on the fossil record, and we can say, okay, how many changes are there? That is the rate at which they occur.
Right.
We can also do single sperm studies, and that's probably the way of the future in doing this in a much more scientific way. If you scan several sperm and you look at the rate of de novo mutations that occur in the sperm, you can actually calculate literally the rate of mutation in the human genome. So we basically know that rate, and Craig's analysis has not changed that. Okay, so
Is there
that's
a
that's
time
what we use.
associated with it? Like
Yes.
it's 10,000 years
50 per
N17?
genome per generation, roughly.
15?
50.
50.
50 per genome per generation, roughly.
Okay.
So we have a very good estimate of the
Okay.
rate at which these single nucleotide changes occurs. So Craig's results are not going to change our estimates of divergence times between
Okay.
individuals. What they do, though, is they reveal a different type of variation. So the copy number variation, where you can have a gene that's duplicated or triplicated or quadruplicated. You can have genes that are inverted. You can have insertions and deletions. The level of variation in those types of changes is much higher than we ever suspected. And so that's what the analysis is really showing. We don't know that much about the rate at which those happen, and we need to study that. And we ideally would incorporate that into the analyses. But clearly there is a lot more underlying variation, yes, than we suspected. Does it change the divergence estimates? No.
No, okay.
Now, I think a much more important thing to come out of the analysis that Craig published is that the genome is very much becoming personalized.
Yes.
The genie is out of the bottle, and people are going to be doing this. Someone
Right.
has done it now. Everyone is going to be doing this routinely within a generation, and a lot of people are going to be doing it within the next 5 to 10 years.
Are you going to
genome.
copyright yours?
No, I'm not going to copyright my genome. Would I release all the information to the public domain with the medical records? At this point, no, because I'm worried about discrimination. I
Right.
think the healthcare system needs to change first.
I see.
But eventually, I think this will drive a change in the way we fund healthcare in the
Oh, of
United
course,
States.
because that might be the downside, but the upside is that medicine and your healthcare is totally customized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the idea that you have access to all of this information,
Yeah.
whereas it's been in the hands of physicians up until
Right,
now.
right.
If you have access to your medical records and your genomic information, and you can analyze it yourself and go onto the internet and look at the correlations between medical conditions and particular genetic variants, it gives you a lot of power. It gives you a sense of control over your life. You're not
Right.
operating in the dark. If you have a higher susceptibility to whatever it might be, lung cancer, then yeah, maybe you should never start smoking. I mean, no one should anyway. We know that it's healthier, but maybe it'll give you extra pause.
That was going to be actually my next question is if you would care to comment on the ethical concerns that are about to arise because of the fact that knowing as much as we are likely to know about our own genomes, there are possibilities in terms of intervening for health, behavior, and intelligence.
I think it's better to know than it is not to know. I think, people should want to find out this information because it gives you, again, a sense of empowerment over your own health and your own life and the direction that you're going to take. Now, genes don't determine anything except in a few rare cases. Yes, there are some rare Mendelian diseases, where if you have the gene, there's a 100% chance you're going to have the disorder. In general, though, most of these genetic variants predispose in a certain way. They increase your risk or your likelihood by a factor of 2 or 3. So instead of having a 1% chance of getting diabetes, you might have a 2% chance of getting diabetes. What does that mean? Most people don't really understand probability.
Right.
What that means is that you go from having a 99% chance of not having it to a 98% chance.
Exactly.
So, it's not a huge effect. I'm worried about misinterpretation. I do think that routinely, in vitro fertilization is becoming more common in our society as women delay having children and it's harder to get pregnant. A lot of women in their
Right.
early 40s now trying to get pregnant. IVF is becoming much more common. And I think as we learn more about the genome, people are going to be more likely to want to test these genetic variants in the embryo that they decide to implant. If you've seen the film Gattaca, I think that is going to happen at some point. Are they going to choose particular variants that determine or help to determine physical appearance? Possibly. I don't know. We don't have any genes identified yet that clearly affect intelligence, but there are probably genetic variants that do affect it in some way. They don't determine it, but they probably do affect those traits in some way. I think people probably will start to test for some of these things. I think it's inevitable. Should we regulate this? Probably, but I don't know that it's possible in places like the United States where there are private clinics and anything is possible if you have enough money. It does concern me that basically it will be driven by money and access to these technologies, and a certain segment of society will have access to all of this stuff, and it might lead to a general genetic divergence within that group from the larger group. Shades of Aldous Huxley. It's a little worrying, but I think the potential benefits are far too important to kill the research. I think we need to continue learning more about the genome and how it affects all of these characteristics, both disease states and the normal range of variation.
So, given the alternatives insofar as such things are concerned, Uh, One is to preemptively regulate and moderate and control, and circumscribe the field within which these things operate, or let the market decide.
Yeah, yeah.
Which side would you fall on?
Well, it depends. I mean, when it's a question of the commons, I think, it's been shown pretty resoundingly by a lot of economists that, you have to regulate
The
those
market
things.
mechanism doesn't always
Well,
for all the potential tragedies of the
the government
commons.
has to help create a market.
Sure.
So if we think about pollution and carbon credits and so on, that's one way of creating a market that's actually going to help the environment, which is part of the commons. In this case, these are individual decisions, and it's very difficult to regulate those individual decisions. I mean, you're deciding about your children. We make lots of other decisions about our children where we don't have to consult the government, including significant decisions about their entire lives, where they're going to go to school, what they're going to study, et cetera, who they can marry. I don't think it's possible to really regulate that. But I do think that educating people about these genetic variants is incredibly important, and that's part of the reason I spend so much time communicating science, because we don't really understand how the genome works yet. Okay? If you read through the genetic epidemiological studies and you see, a 2 times higher risk, a relative risk of 2 for a particular genetic variant associated with the disease, that's studying one particular effect of that gene in isolation. And in fact, most genes are pleiotropic, as we say. So there are other effects that gene probably has, particularly for complex traits like intelligence. There could be knock-on effects of the genes that are being studied. So you may find a genetic variant that is twice as likely to increase your IQ score by a factor of 10, but it might also give you a higher risk of schizophrenia or manic depression.
Like we say,
how do you choose which genes you want in your kids? I mean, what are you actually bequeathing to them?
Yeah, it's a fine line between genius and madness on the one hand, but then you tinker with either one, you could end up with leukemia or something else on the other.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar with Jared Diamond's work, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Collapse, and so on. Is there a coincidence or a variance relative to what you find using the pathways that you are using to understand human traverse?
Oh, I think there's a clear coincidence.
There is.
I mean, yeah.
Would you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, Jared, certainly in that book, I really enjoyed Guns, Germs, and Steel, but I thought it was the elaboration of something that he had talked about in The Third Chimpanzee, his first major book, which I actually thought was a much better read. But, basically in Guns, Germs, and Steel, he was talking about the history of the last 10,000 years and attempting to answer this deceptively simple question that he's asked at the beginning by a New Guinea.
Why the white man
why
has all the
Why do you
cargo?
white guys have all the cargo?
Right.
So why do you have so much more stuff than we do? Why are you richer? Why are you more advanced technologically? And he traces it to geography and the idea that the transmission of ideas, the speed with which you're transmitting ideas across geographic zones horizontally within the same latitude, increase the rate of social change, and that's why Eurasian populations tend to be better off than a lot of the tropical groups. I think that's entirely valid, and I think certainly a lot of the things that he went through in that book that had very little to do with that core thesis, tracing the Bantu expansion and so on. They're themes that I explore in my own research, and there's a clear coincidence between what he's writing about and what we find.
What would Spencer Wells see himself doing when he is 48 years old?
Oh my goodness. I don't know. I have been thinking about this recently. I mean, we're about midway through the Genographic project, and to be able to head a project like this at my relatively tender age is a huge honor. And I don't know exactly what I'm going to be doing at the end of it. I do know that there are certain things that I want to continue doing, whether I am still a practicing scientist or not. I want to continue to synthesize scientific ideas, to write about them, to educate the general public, get people involved. I feel very strongly that science is something that the public can contribute to. And that's part of the reason why we have the public participation side of our project. It's kind of Science 2.0. Where people can play an actual role in the science. And I think particularly, in the genomics revolution and with the idea that people are going to be sequencing their own genomes and compiling all this data, I think, they could play a vital role in understanding the patterns of genetic variation. So getting these stories out to people, books, films, articles, and so on. In 10 years, I would like to think that the Genographic project will be viewed as groundbreaking, a new model for doing scientific projects. I might possibly be involved in something else like the Genographic Project, something that is, looking at the interaction between genes and phenotype in a much more explicit way. That could be in the private sector. It could be, working with a university, possibly. But I think this whole notion of, the genome having an impact on society, and we're right on the cusp of where that's starting to happen, and people are starting to realize it, and it's starting to enter, the common parlance, and it's appearing in ads and television.
It's changing the entire field of the social sciences dramatically.
It is, and I think again that education is such a vital part of that. Telling people what's true and what isn't, what we actually know and what is speculation. Is critical, because it's a very powerful technology. I mean, when we're choosing the genes to put in our children, we're choosing the genes to put in every generation that comes after that. And it's a kind of transgenerational power that, we haven't really had access to before. We're shooting a genetic bullet, way into the future, thousands of years. And where is that bullet going to come to rest? What's the ultimate possibility of response or reaction from doing that?
Was there a single experience, person, book that got you started on this path long ago? Long ago, relatively.
Well, it was a combination of things. I mean, I actually wanted to be a historian when I was a kid. Much more interested in history and archaeology. Saw the King Tut exhibit that toured the States.
Oh, yes.
Back in 77 and 78, stood in line in the rain
Right.
for 12 hours in New Orleans to get my ticket, and went in with my parents and was blown away. I mean, it was like you were looking at something that was created the day before, but it was thousands of years old, 3,500 years old. And, just became obsessed with this idea of time travel. Like, can you imagine what it would have been like to be alive at the time of the ancient Egyptians, or the Greeks, or the Romans, or whatever, some of these other groups, the Phoenicians, vanished peoples. And really only got interested in science secondarily when my mother went back to school to get her PhD in biology. So she had a huge effect on me. She showed me that science can be fun and fascinating, and it's about solving puzzles. I mean, it's not just about the guys in the white lab coats speaking a funny
Doing
language.
something really obscure.
Yeah, doing something obscure. It's really about trying to understand the way the world works. And it is a huge intellectual challenge, but it's also fun and fascinating. So she had a huge impact on me. My high school biology teacher, Charles Swift, had a huge impact on me. For the same reason, he started to show me, the wonders of biological science, and how fascinating the world is, and the world right under our noses. You look through a microscope and you see all these incredible things that you didn't even dream about. So he was a huge impact. And then my advisor in college, who encouraged me to go work with Dick Lewontin at Harvard. Mark Kirkpatrick, I did an independent study course with him in theoretical population genetics. Was very interested in being a theoretical geneticist, mathematical geneticist when I went off to graduate school, and ended up becoming more of an experimentalist. But, big questions like, why do we have sex? Why does sex exist? Because it actually doesn't seem very adaptive. It seems like it would be better to reproduce your genes in their entirety without sharing them with somebody else. And in fact, they're very important
but
theoretical
it's the fun
reasons.
and pleasure part.
Aside from the fun and pleasure, I'm just talking about an evolutionary sense. So
yeah, it seems pointless when there are other ways to get around.
yeah,
doing
exactly.
it.
If you could clone yourself,
Exactly.
then you could potentially beat out everybody else, including your spouse. So,
We're getting there. Anyway.
So, and then, Dick Lewontin, obviously, huge impact on me. I really started to see the social impact of what we were doing as geneticists in his lab with the historians and philosophers of science who came through. Ed Wilson, who was on the floor just underneath us, and, interacting with him, and Ernst Mayr, and, just stellar minds. So that was, a huge experience for me, being up at Harvard for 5 years. And then, of course, working with Cavalli Sforza, who really got me excited about working with indigenous people and becoming more of an anthropologist. And he said, you need to get out and meet these people. I mean, these are people, and you need to learn something about their cultures and live with them. And, it's very important for what we do.
Well, I think, Spencer, this interview shows that the Kistler Prize is a very important prize in terms of precisely what you have described so far, is the importance of studying the relationship between genome and the phenotype, or genome and society. So Walter actually is far ahead of his time in
Mm.
putting the emphasis on it. And I think this interview also shows why you are very deserving of the 2007 Kessler Prize.
Thank you, Sesh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.